She hadn't planned to be there. The ticket had been a gift from her niece, a young woman who thought it might be nice for her aunt to get out of the apartment for an evening, so she had put on her best coat, the one she'd bought in 1947, when money still meant something, and she had taken the subway to the Ed Sullivan Theatre on a Sunday night in 1963. She was 68 years old. Her hands were spotted with age. Her face, once photographed by the greatest portrait artists in Hollywood, was now lined with decades of disappointment. She sat in the balcony, far from the stage, and watched Ed Sullivan introduce the Beatles to America for the first time. 73 million people were watching, and not one of them knew that sitting in that balcony was a woman who had once been more famous than any of them. Until Ed Sullivan looked up, and everything changed. It happened during a commercial break. The Beatles had just finished their first set. The audience was screaming. Ed Sullivan was standing at center stage, waiting for the cameras to roll again. When he glanced up toward the balcony, he did that sometimes, scanned the crowd, looked at faces. Most hosts don't. They stay in the bubble of the stage, the lights, the script. But Ed had always been different. He liked to see who was watching, and when his eyes landed on the woman in the balcony, he stopped moving. His face changed. The stage manager started counting down, 15 seconds to air. But Ed wasn't listening. He was staring at the balcony, at a face he hadn't seen in 30 years. Ed Sullivan turned to his stage manager and said something. The man looked confused, shook his head. Ed said it again, more forcefully this time. The stage manager's eyes went wide. He looked up at the balcony, then back at Ed, then spoke urgently into his headset. In the control room, producers were scrambling. The schedule was locked. The Beatles were the story. 73 million people were watching. You don't derail a show like this. You don't change the plan. But Ed Sullivan wasn't asking. He was and when the cameras came back on, he didn't introduce the next segment. He did something that no one in that theater, no one watching at home, was prepared for. He said a name, a woman's name, spoken slowly, carefully, like a prayer. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just seen someone in our audience tonight, and I need you to know who she is. The audience went quiet. The Beatles, standing in the wings, stopped talking. Ed continued, her name is Norma Talmadge. And if you don't know that name, you should. He paused, looked up at the balcony. Norma, are you still there? The camera operators scrambled to find her. The spotlight swung upward, and there she was, an elderly woman in a worn coat, her face frozen in shock, her hand covering her mouth. She shook her head. No. Please, no. But Ed Sullivan wasn't letting this go. Norma Talmadge was one of the biggest stars in the history of motion pictures. In the 1920s, her name was above the title. Her face sold millions of tickets. She was one of the first women to own her own production company. She made films that defined an era. The audience was silent now, listening, learning, and then sound came to pictures. And Hollywood forgot her, just like that. One of the greatest stars who ever lived. And the world moved on. His voice had an edge to it now, not anger, sadness. That's not right. That's never been right. To understand what Ed Sullivan was doing, you have to understand who Norma Talmadge had been. In the 1920s, she wasn't just a star, she was royalty. The Talmadge sisters, Norma, Constance, and Natalie, had ruled Hollywood. Norma was the dramatic one, the serious actress, the one who made women cry and men fall in love. She had her own production company at a time when women weren't even allowed in studio boardrooms. She commanded salaries that rivaled any man. Her films, pictures like Camille and Smiling Through, were events. And then in 1929, sound arrived, and Norma Talmadge's voice, captured on film for the first time, didn't match her image. It was too high, too nasal, too Brooklyn. Audiences laughed, not at her performance, at her voice. And just like that, after 2 decades of stardom, she was finished. She tried to adapt, made a few sound films, but the damage was done. By 1930, She had retired. By 1935, she was divorced from the producer who had built her career. By 1940, she was living quietly, her fortune spent, her name fading from memory. And by 1963, she was invisible, just another elderly woman on a subway. No one recognized her, no one remembered. She had made peace with that, or at least, she had tried. And now, sitting in the balcony of the Ed Sullivan Theatre, she was being pulled back into a spotlight she had spent 30 years avoiding. Ed Sullivan gestured to the balcony. "Norma, would you stand up? Please, just so these people can see you." She didn't move. The camera stayed on her. The audience waited. And then, slowly, with visible reluctance, she stood. The applause started immediately. Not polite applause, something deeper. People in the audience who had never heard her name were clapping because they understood what they were witnessing, the resurrection of a ghost. Ed nodded. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you gave us." She sat back down quickly, her face red, her hands shaking, but Ed wasn't done. He turned back to the camera, to America. "I want to tell you something. We live in a culture that forgets. We move fast, we chase the new, and we leave people behind." Norma Talmadge gave her life to entertaining people. She was one of the first, one of the best. And when the world changed, we didn't just move on. We erased her, like she never mattered. He paused. Let the words land. That's wrong. And tonight, on this show, in front of all of you, I want to say thank you. Thank you, Norma. You mattered. You still matter. The audience erupted, not because they were told to, because they felt it. The camera cut back to Norma in the balcony. She was crying, not the polite tears of someone overwhelmed, the deep shaking sobs of someone who had been carrying weight for decades and had just been allowed to put it down. People around her reached out, touched her shoulder, held her hand. Strangers offering comfort to a woman they'd never heard of 5 minutes ago. Ed Sullivan stood on that stage and watched. And for just a moment, the man who prided himself on control let his own composure slip. His eyes were wet, but Ed Sullivan wasn't finished. He did something no one expected. He invited her down. Not as a gimmick, not as a quick wave and applause. He stopped the show and asked her to come to the stage. The ushers helped her navigate the stairs. It took time. She was old. Her knees didn't work the way they once had. The audience waited in total silence. Every step she took was visible, every moment of struggle. And when she finally reached the stage, Ed Sullivan met her at the steps. He took her hand, helped her up, and walked her to center stage. He didn't interview her the way he would a celebrity. He didn't ask about her career or her films, or what she'd been doing for the past 30 years. He just stood beside her, let the audience see her, let the cameras capture her face, and then he said, simply, "This is what a legend looks like." The applause was deafening. Norma stood there, her hand in Ed's. And for the first time in 3 decades, she wasn't invisible. She was seen, she was remembered, she was honored. What happened next became part of television history. Ed Sullivan, who was known for running a tight ship, for keeping to the schedule no matter what, spent the next 10 minutes talking with Norma Talmadge. He asked her about the early days of Hollywood, about working with D.W. Griffith, about what it was like to be a woman in an industry run entirely by men. She answered in a voice that was, yes, higher than expected, but it was also warm, human, real, and the audience listened, not because she was performing, but because she was there, present, alive. Ed asked her what she missed most about making films. She thought for a long moment, then said quietly that she missed mattering, missed feeling like what she did made a difference. The silence that followed was heavy. Ed nodded. Didn't try to fix it with a joke, just let the truth sit there. Then he said, "You still matter. You always did." She looked at him, and something in her face softened, like she'd been waiting 30 years to hear those words. When the segment ended, Ed walked Norma off stage himself. The audience stood, every single person. The applause didn't stop. The Beatles, waiting in the wings to perform their second set, were clapping too. Paul McCartney would later say in an interview that watching Ed Sullivan honor Norma Talmadge taught him something about what fame should be. Not about holding onto it, but about recognizing it in others. About lifting people up instead of stepping over them. The next morning, newspapers across the country ran stories, not about the Beatles, about Norma Talmadge, about the woman America had forgotten. Film archives started pulling her movies. Theaters scheduled retrospectives. A publisher approached her about an autobiography. And for the final years of her life, Norma Talmadge was remembered, not as a relic, as a pioneer, as someone who had mattered. Ed Sullivan never took credit for it, never mentioned it again. But people who worked on the show said he kept a photo of that night on his desk for the rest of his life. Norma, standing on his stage, finally seen. Ed Sullivan hosted his show for 23 years. He introduced America to Elvis, to the Beatles, to countless stars who would define generations. But the moment that people who were there never forgot wasn't a performance. It was this. The night he stopped the show for a woman no one remembered. The night he chose to use his platform, not to entertain, but to honor, to restore, to say that the people we forget still matter. That night in 1963, with 73 million people watching, and the Beatles waiting in the wings, Ed Sullivan made a choice. He chose to see someone invisible. He chose to stop the machine. He chose to say that fame and youth and newness aren't the only things that matter, that the people who came before, who built the industry, who gave their lives to the work, deserve to be remembered. And in doing that, he proved that real power isn't about who you can promote, it's about who you choose to protect. The cameras kept rolling. The Beatles performed. The show went on. But for those 10 minutes, television became something more than entertainment. It became a place where the forgotten could be found, where the erased could be restored, where an old woman in a worn coat could stand on a stage and be told in front of the entire country that her life had mattered. What would you have done if you'd been in Ed's position? If this story moved you, consider subscribing. These moments deserve to be remembered.